Hello BookTube, it's Roz and it is the 4th of July and that means that I'm shamefully overdue to do a July TBR. And what does July mean? It means Jane Austen, hurrah! Is it my favourite BookTube event of the year? I don't know, that's really hard to say, isn't it? What I do know is it's the one that Tilly, my daughter, Tilly Shelf, kind of used to suck me into the world of BookTube. So it has a special kind of place in my heart, I guess. So most of this TBR is going to be Jane Austen July stuff. But I've got a few other bits that I need to read this month. One of the other things that I'm doing this month is judging the BookTube Prize a fiction group for the semi-finals, and the first thing I had to do in July, which I did and finished today, was read the last of my group of books that I hadn't yet read, and that was Apeirogon by Colum McCann. So finished that this morning. There are 3 other books in my group that I've read previously that I'll need to kind of just revisit and refresh in my mind so I can judge them fairly, and that's A Mirror in the Light by Hilary Mantel, Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. So they've got a feature somewhere in this month before the day when I have to submit my rankings. But that shouldn't be too painful, should be quite quick. Well, what do I mean painful? They should be really enjoyable, shouldn't they? They're all good books. I'm trying at the moment to fit a graphic novel in more regularly, because I'm going through one of my periodic phases of thinking I need to work out why it is other people enjoy graphic novels so much. And I probably could find a Jane Austen related one, but instead I've gone for one called In by Will McPhail. It came out in May, and I've heard a couple of booktubers whose opinions I respect. I think one of them was Daniel Guilty Feet, and another might have been Steve Donahue, kind of enthuse about this graphic novel. So I'm going for it. Luckily, the library had it, my wonderful local library. The other thing that I have to read that isn't either BookTube Prize or Jane Austen July related is for my real life in the flesh book group, and that's Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers, which was a book from 2020. So, but apart from that, basically everything is Jane Austen July related, and I am going to do all the reading prompts. There are watching prompts as well as part of Jane Austen July, and it's really nice that our hosts, and that's Katie Books and Things, Marissa of Blatantly Bookish, and this year for the first time Claudia of Spinster's Library. That nearly went out of my head for a moment, sorry Claudia. They include watching prompts, which is really good, I think, for kind of accessibility and getting people's enthusiasm. But you know me, it's all about the books, so you know, I may or may not watch something, we'll see. What I did watch is the brilliant first Jane Austen July video that Claudia has done, and I warmly recommend it, and I'll link to it below, which was a kind of like a game show, a Jane Austen related game show, Jane Austen Taskmaster. You've got to watch it, it's great. So the one essential prompt for Jane Austen July is to read one of Jane's 6 main novels, and this year I'm really treating myself because I'm going to reread Persuasion. Now, when people ask me which is my favourite Jane Austen novel, you know, my joke is, well, it's the one that I reread most recently. But if push comes to shove, I will always say Persuasion. And but I haven't read it for a few years, so it's time to remind myself why it's my favourite. Another of the prompts is to read one of Jane's lesser works, and last year I read some of her early stuff, volume 1 of, you know, of her juvenilia is the word. This year I'm going to read Sanditon, which was the thing she was working on when she died, and you know, it's unfinished. There's only about 50-60 pages of it. Here we go. Look, I can do book waving this time. There we go. This is my copy that's got Sanditon in it. I have a bit of an aversion to reading unfinished books. I kind of expect that to be, I don't know, unsatisfactory somehow. Tilly, who has read Sanditon, so although I read, Jane Austen a bit, with huge obsessive enthusiasm, I've never read Sanditon. But Tilly promises me that it doesn't matter that it's not finished, in the sense that it's very much just sort of setting things up, and you don't get caught up in any kind of plot that you'll then be frustrated about not knowing the outcome of. So I hope she's right. What I didn't do was show you the copies of Persuasion that I'm going to be reading. I knew there was a reason why I hesitated when I'd just been talking about it, and before I went on to talking about Sanditon, and it's come back to me now. So I've got 2 editions in paper, and one of those is this one, which is your classic kind of Penguin classic version, with a very nice picture of Lyme Regis on it, in which was where part of the story happens, and a place that I very much love. But the other edition I have, I just wanted to share with you. Okay, it's one from the 1970s. Now, first, I will show you the fairly tasteful sort of inside cover. So this is, very respectable looking, yeah. Okay, but I just love the 1970s style picture on the front of this. Look at that. Look at those. Look at those legs. Look at those legs. It's got a very kind of sexist quality, hasn't it, this as a cover? Anyway, moving on. Now the next, well, I'm going to be doing these in order, but who cares? The next sort of Jane Austen July prompt is to read a modern novel inspired by her work. So it could be a retelling, or just sort of jumping off from one of her books. Now this is the prompt that I find most difficult each year, I think, because I just tend to be really disappointed by those books. I don't know, it's like they can't match up to Jane's sort of quality of writing, and I don't know, they often frustrate me. But in a spirit of optimism, I'm going to read this year The Other Bennet Sister, which is by Janice Hadlow, and it's a retell, or it's the story of Mary, the other Bennet sister, as it says in Pride and Prejudice, and I'm hoping I'm going to enjoy that, because I do feel like Mary gets a relatively raw deal in that book, and so yeah, I'm hopeful that I will enjoy that one. Next prompt is to read a book of non-fiction associated with Jane Austen, so about the period in which she lived, historical context, or about her, or and this has turned out over the last couple of years to be a really successful prompt for me. It's got me to read things that I perhaps knew intellectually I would find interesting, but would never have got around to if I hadn't had the extra push of Jane Austen July. And last year that was Lucy Worsley's Jane Austen at Home. This year I've kind of got 2, and one is 100% down the line Jane Austen associated, and that's The Real Jane Austen, A Life in Small Things by Paula Byrne. And it's kind of talking about Jane's life through things, actual objects associated with her, and I have a feeling it may be a bit similar to the Lucy Worsley, Jane Austen at Home, which told her life through the various places she lived, but that quite appeals to me as a sort of a style, I guess, of non-fiction writing about Jane. But the other thing I'm going to read is this, Empireland by Sathnam Sanghera. Now, which is a pretty new, like, when did it come out? Certainly, beginning, I think it came out beginning of 2021, and it's a book about the British Empire. Now, there's 2 kind of key bits of context that you kind of it's useful to be aware of when reading Jane Austen. And one of those is the fact that the Napoleonic Wars were like the backdrop of the period she's writing about. So England was at war with France basically all through, the majority of her adult life. And her family certainly did get caught up in that. And the other is that it was at a point when the British Empire was kind of really taking off. It was moving into its sort of major second period. If you think of the early British Empire as being like the American colonies and so on, and then you have the American, and the West Indies, American War of Independence, and the British Empire almost sort of has to reinvent itself, and its possessions in India are really kind of becoming more significant to it, and so on at the time that Jane Austen is writing, and it's also totally predicated on trade and commerce, with a key part of that being slavery and the slave trade. Although the slave trade is abolished during Jane's lifetime, it's fundamental to understanding the lives of the class of English people that she writes about in her novels. So a book about the British Empire feels like very appropriate to read whilst pursuing Jane Austen in July, but I couldn't choose this as my main non-fiction choice because it really features or focuses more on the later empire, sort of which is sort of perhaps after Jane's death. The absolute peak of the British Empire was at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. There we go, that's a non-fiction prompt. Now then, the last reading prompt for Jane Austen July is to read something by one of Jane's contemporaries. It's another prompt that I enjoy because it pushes me into different reading, and I've got a particular sort of twist on it this year, I suppose, in that I'm using it to choose both my poetry choice for this month and my the play that Tilly and I will read and talk about in a discussion drama video. And what we were looking for was something that's not just by one of Jane's contemporaries, but someone that we know that she herself read. She was an avid reader, we know, and she loved poetry and she loved the theatre. So it's not too much of a challenge to find something that she read. Poetry, she read kind of all the contemporary poets, and the ones, people like Wordsworth and Byron she read and are still popular today. But her favourite poet, as far as we know, was William Cowper, spelt Cowper but pronounced Cooper. And Cooper is not particularly popular these days. So I thought I would read a selection of Cooper's work and try and see, why did Jane rate him so highly? So that's the poetry. Play, even better. Okay, now, if you've read Mansfield Park, you know that it's quite an important plot point in the book that the young people in Mansfield Park decide to put on a play in the house. So like kind of amateur dramatics, which was a very popular thing to do at that time. And they consider and discard a few possible plays, and one of the ones that they consider and discard was William Sheridan's A School for Scandal. So that kind of put it up there as a possible one to do. But better still, it turns out that Jane Austen herself took part in a kind of a house party amateur dramatic performance of A School for Scandal and played the part. We even know which part she played. It was Mrs. Candour. So how could we resist that? It's also nice to know that William Sheridan described Pride and Prejudice as one of the cleverest things he'd ever read. So Sheridan and I sort of have the same opinion of Jane Austen, it seems. So that is my Jane Austen July plans. Do tell me about yours, particularly if you're reading any of the same things that I am, because it would be lovely to share thoughts.